track seminar speaker. He's an associate professor of mechanical engineering at Iowa State, and he's leading the integrated design and engineering analysis, the IDEA lab. He was a PhD from Berkeley and then postdoc at UCSD. He's a recipient of the prestigious Career Award in 2018 for developing GPU accelerated tool for patient-specific cardiac modeling. But he has been, working on many different things, including computer-aided design, GPU, parallel algorithms, machine learning, biomechanics, patient-specific heart modeling, solid mechanics, computational geometry, and then many other things that I know that he didn't mention here. It's been extremely well funded from NSF, ARPA-E, NASA, NIH, and ONR. So without further ado, Adarsh, please go ahead.
Thanks, Soumik, for the great introduction. So Soumik asked me to start off the seminar series for track, and I thought this might be a good general topic for everybody to understand. So I'm mainly going to talk about data-driven computational modeling for cardiovascular mechanics. And what I'm going to do is start first with the traditional computational modeling approach, and then slowly transition to data-driven and machine learning approaches towards the end. So this will also serve as a good way to see how we were able to take a traditional simulation process and then bring in machine learning and artificial intelligence into that.
Adarsh, sorry to interrupt. You are recording, right?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Thanks. Please go ahead.
So essentially, this will serve as a nice way for our center, basically, which shows how we can translate AI from standard algorithmic computer science approaches to domain-specific approaches. Just to give a brief motivation of my talk, so cardiovascular diseases are the leading cause of death all over the world, and specifically if you look at the US, these are the death rates for cardiovascular diseases all over, and you can see that Iowa is somewhere in the middle. It's predominantly much more higher in the south, and basically, there's been a lot of money spent on finding cures for cardiovascular diseases. And you can see these are the amount of money spent by different companies. These are the 4 big ones that are in the US, but then there are a lot more healthcare costs associated with cardiovascular diseases. So that gives you a very broad overview of why this study is important. And what particularly we are interested in is what is called as personalized medicine. So till now, it has been assumed that whatever you have as treatment is based on groups of people. So most of the treatments are based on statistical averages. But then for the last 10 years or so, there's been this new idea that patient-specific variations can lead to different outcomes. So the idea is basically take patient-specific data. So these could be things like MRI and CT scan to get the geometry of the heart, for example, or take pressure measurements, ECG measurements, and then integrate them together with computational models so that we can develop what are called as predictive models. So these can predict what can be the outcome of a particular treatment. So basically, you can simulate patient-specific heart conditions and then predict what the particular treatment to a particular therapy could be for a particular patient. Obviously, there are several challenges associated with this. First, we need to have ability to get the patient-specific data like geometry, etc. And then we need to create a computational model that can replicate the patient-specific function, and then finally create something that can be called as a predictive model. So obviously, current manual methods are very slow, and that's where some of my research and researchers in this field have been going forward, is to develop automated methods to create this patient-specific models. On the other hand, the second part of the talk, I also wanted to focus on a specific aspect of heart diseases called as valvular diseases. So these are basically the disease of the heart valve. So each heart has 4 valves. You have the mitral valve, the aortic valve, the tricuspid valve, and the pulmonary valve. And these 4 valves essentially can have like thickening or essentially have calcification, which can essentially prevent the valves from opening accurately, or they could have they may not close accurately, which might lead to regurgitation, which is basically backflow of the fluid. So the only way to treat valve diseases right now is basically a surgical replacement where they put in a prosthetic valve. And you can see that this is very, very common recently. So in order to model both the cardiac models and these valve models, we need to have specialized tools. And one of the tools that we use is what is called as multi-scale modeling. So these are models that span both length or time scales. So you can see that like modeling the heart, you have to model from the smallest cells to all the way to the organ level. And the way you can model them is you can either model them sequentially. So you can go from one scale to another sequentially, or you can model them in a concurrent manner where you solve the smaller scale model first and then go to larger scale models. But what is interesting with these multi-scale models is that complex behavior can arise. So for example, just in the case of the heart, so you have essentially the cross bridge, which is basically the proteins that move inside the cells. And that's what causes the heart cell to contract. So this is one single heart cell which is contracting. And then if you take a regular arrangement of these heart cells, you get to the complete heart, which can essentially contract and pump the blood to the ventricles. So this is one aspect. The other aspect is multi-physics aspect of cardiovascular diseases. So if you want to model the whole heart, so this is a animation of what is happening. So you have not just the walls that are contracting, but you also have some electrical signals that are passed, which essentially synchronize the contraction of the heart muscles. So that you have to model the electrical signals. Then you have the heart muscles itself moving. Then you have the valves which open and close. Then you have the blood flow, which basically goes through the ventricles and the atria. And then you cannot model the heart as a standalone model. You have to couple that with the blood flow in the whole body. So that's where you have to couple it with some what are called as reduced order models or one-dimensional models for the whole or zero-dimensional models for the whole blood flow simulations. So with that brief background, I wanted to focus on, like I said, 2 main applications. The first one is the 4-chamber heart model that we have developed. And then going further, we wanted to look in detail with the valve modeling. And then I wanted to show some recent results that we have on basically what are called as physics-informed machine learning. So like I said, my research focuses mainly on what are called as biomechanics or the solid biomechanics. So what I focus on is the heart wall itself, basically the muscles. And till probably like 5-6 years back, people only model the ventricles because the ventricles are the most important part of the heart itself. So essentially they model the ventricles using the simplified model, which looks like an ellipsoid or 2 ellipsoids put together, and essentially try to figure out the computational aspects. But the disadvantage of this is that you ignore the atria and all the blood vessels and the big vessels. And this can essentially lead to sort of artificial movement of the ventricles themselves. So what we wanted to do was to develop a complete 4-chamber heart model, which has all the 4 chambers. So these are the left ventricle and the right ventricles, and then the left atrium and the right atrium, and also include the major blood vessels, which is the aorta and the pulmonary artery. And essentially, we have developed a pipeline that can essentially create these 4-chamber models. So obviously, there are certain aspects that needs to be taken care of when you want to create these 4-chamber model. So first, we need to get the geometry of the heart itself. Then we need to model the muscles. In the heart, the muscles are oriented in a particular order, and we need to model that. And like I said before, we need to couple the heart itself with the circulation model, which is a 0D or a reduced order model. And then ultimately, we can get the complete simulation of the heart. So in terms of the geometry, we make use of what are called as cubic Hermite elements. So these are higher order elements, not linear elements. And the advantage is that if you are using linear elements, you have to use a very large number of elements. So a similar approach back in 2016, people had used almost 95 million elements. On the other hand, our approach, which is the cubic Hermite, we can essentially model this complex geometry with only around 500 elements, or essentially 30,000 degrees of freedom. And the reason why we were able to do that is that these higher order elements can be much more smoother than linear elements. So essentially, we can get a smooth cardiac model with very few number of elements as shown here. But obviously, what needs to be done for able to model these higher order elements and complex geometries is what are called as extraordinary nodes. So in regular finite element analysis, you have these regular nodes where you have a set of 4 in 2D, 4 elements coming together. Whereas if you want to model such complex geometries, you need to handle these nodes, which have more than 4 elements coming together, or 4 edges coming together. So in this case, there are 5 edges coming together. If you're doing it linear, there's no issue because essentially each of these will be line elements. On the other hand, since we are doing higher order elements, what we need to do is we need to maintain the derivative across these lines, which are shown here. And essentially, we have developed a mathematical approach where we can use a single set of coordinate system and then map it to that coordinate system to get these smooth elements to work out. Obviously, I'm not going into details, but if you have any questions, feel free to ask me later. So that was the geometry. Then we have to model the muscle fibers themselves, or the muscle itself. So essentially, in the heart, the muscles are arranged like in a particular order. If you take a cross section, the muscle fibers are oriented at an angle of +60 to the circumferential direction on the outside, and around -60 to the circumferential direction on the inside. So you see this sort of helical structure for the muscle fibers themselves. So what we do is we make use of constitutive relationships. So these are continuum models, which can model these muscle cells. And this models how passively the cells can stretch. And we also model, so one of the things is that if you stretch the muscle cells a little bit, they are very soft, but then the more you stretch them, the more harder they get. So these are what are called as hyperelastic elements or hyperelastic materials. So we model them using the hyperelastic equations. And not only that, like I said, each muscle cell can contract. So we need to model the active force that is being generated by each of these muscle cells. So we also model that in the complete model. So one of the things that we had to handle, like I said, is how to interpolate between the muscle cells smoothly between going from the outside to the inside. So we use what we call as a log Euclidean transformation, which is basically taking a coordinate axis and smoothly rotating it or transforming it from one location to another. And essentially, we can do that to get the smooth muscle cells. So once we have the model of the heart wall itself, like I said, we need to couple that with the circulation model of the entire body. And this is done using what are called as reduced order model or as a circuit model. So essentially, the blood vessels are modeled as resistances, and there's a pressure drop across the blood vessels. And then each chamber is modeled as capacitances, which essentially have which can store blood basically. And we then solve a set of iterative differential equations where we try to match the finite element model, which is the heart model, the volume of the ventricles with the actual volume of the ventricles that have been computed using the reduced order model. And we iteratively solve for this to get the complete coupling between the finite element model and the circulation model. And once we do that, we can apply appropriate boundary conditions. So we can assume that the blood vessels are fixed, they don't move. We then apply the blood pressure on all the 4 chambers, and then we can essentially simulate the complete cardiac cycle. So in this, you can see that this is the left ventricle. Sorry, this is the left ventricle, this is the right ventricle, and you can see blood comes in, fills up, and goes out. You also notice that there is a slight delay between the contraction of the atria and the ventricles, and we also model that to make sure that it's accurate in the actual simulation. So now that we have the heart walls moving, now we also want to model how the blood flow inside the heart happens. So for that, this is collaboration with a colleague of mine, Ming-Chen Xu, and he does the fluid simulations and also the coupling with the valves. So what we do is we take the heart model or the movement of the heart left ventricle here. We then apply a prescribed displacement and solve what you call as an electrostatic problem to solve the fluid mesh, how the fluid mesh can change. Apply resistance boundary conditions, apply input boundary conditions, and then model the valves with stents. And then we can completely simulate blood flow inside the ventricle. So you can see here, blood enters here, and then exits out of this, out of the aorta. So one thing to note is that these valves that we use here are prosthetic valves. These are not the native valves. And what we wanted to study was how doing a prosthetic valves will essentially change the blood flow inside the heart itself. And that we could essentially study, seeing how if you have a prosthetic valve like this, what happens. And interestingly, we found that in a regular native heart, the blood flow usually enters at a steep angle that is closer to the wall itself, and then it exits out of the aorta like this. On the other hand, for prosthetic valves, the blood flow enters the ventricle at a steep angle, and then there is a reverse circulation of blood inside the heart itself. And we found this in our simulated models, and then we went back and looked at literature, and we found that this has also been reported for other people where they have replaced the mitral valve with the prosthetic valve, and found that there's been a change in the blood flow circulation direction. So this is a good idea of how computational models can help figure out what can be or what can be different in the case of a surgical intervention. So just to summarize, just the 4-chamber heart modeling. So we could simulate a complete 4-chamber heart model. We essentially model the atria also, which allows for physiologically accurate boundary conditions. and then we have a realistic or accurate movement of the whole heart itself. And then we can also assess the effect of prosthetics on the cardiac function. So till now, this is all classic computational modeling. So now I want to take a step forward and see how we can bring in data-driven analysis and machine learning into the process. So for this, we focused mainly on prosthetic heart valves. So like I said before, more than 90,000 heart valve um, uh, uh, replacements are being done in the US itself. And till 10 years back, or even now, people put in what are called, there are two kinds of valves that can be put in. So one is what is called a mechanical valve, so which is basically made up of either like titanium or plastic. And essentially this valve opens and closes to prevent backflow, basically. The advantage of a mechanical valve is it's durable, but the main disadvantage is that these open and close very fast, and whenever there is a blood flow which is going and this is cutting off, this can damage the blood cells, and that can essentially leads to small clots being formed, and people have to take blood thinners to prevent these clots and ultimately to prevent any stroke that can happen. The other quality of life issue with mechanical valves is that they can actually be noisy. So if you have a mechanical valve, you can hear it, and this can lead to severe degradation in quality of life. So recently, people have been looking at what are called as bioprosthetic valves. So these are what they do is they have a stent, which is again made up of a metal or durable plastic material, and then the valves themselves are made from bovine or porcine pericardium. So so these are actual tissues that have been treated and also stretched and sutured onto the stent itself. And the advantage of this is that you can essentially design this valve, so you can adjust the geometry of the valve itself so that it matches well, or it opens and closes well. Obviously, the disadvantage is that they're prone to fatigue, and especially if the match between the actual patient and the valve is not accurate, it can cause things like calcification, which leads to reduced life of the valves. So bioprosthetic valves usually last only 5 to 10 years. So people will probably need another valve after the bioprosthetic valves are not useful anymore. So this is a video of how a bioprosthetic valve opens and closes. So you can see that it's much more closer to what you would see in an actual heart, and it's smooth and it doesn't have any noise issues associated with it. So one of the things that you want to do when you're creating these bioprosthetic valves is, like I said, you can design the valves. So what you can do is you can figure out how well the valves work. So what you can do is you can look at the effective open area, so which is the amount of area the valves open when there is blood flow. Or you can look at what is called as the coaptation area, which is basically the amount of area, overlap area in the valve leaflets as it's closed. So what we looked at was we wanted to figure out a way in which we can design prosthetic valves with a lot of data. And we basically got inspiration from CAD and machine learning. So in CAD, non-uniform rational B-splines are smooth spline surfaces that can be used to represent complex geometry. So for example, like this a hammer model that I showed here. And as you can see here, the surface itself is represented using this set of points called control points. And as you can see, as the control points are moved, they change the local shape of the surface itself. And then going further, there is this new approach called isogeometric analysis, where people have started using these splines or NURBS or non-uniform rational B-splines to use it for both simulation as well as geometry. And the advantages of NURB isogeometric analysis is that they don't approximate the surfaces of the valve with linear approximations. So the image on the middle you see here, you see that in finite element analysis, if you are especially using linear finite elements, you approximate it with linear triangles. So the geometry might not be accurately captured in the final analysis. On the other hand, with IGA, you see that how even a coarse mesh can represent the valve much more accurately. And then obviously collaborating with SOMIC, so we have been looking at how deep learning has been used for medical image analysis. This is what has been used primarily till a few years back, where people have been using it for segmentation, where it can segment out different organs from CT or MRI images. But we wanted to go further and to see whether we can use deep learning for the heart valve analysis. So what we wanted to do was to build a machine learning surrogate that can predict what the deformed configuration or the closed configuration of the heart valve is, given open configuration and the pressure difference in the heart model across the valve. And to do that, we basically have to learn from 3D input, which is basically the valve geometry, and predict the deformed valve geometry. We need to get the effect of the loads and boundary conditions. So like I said, pressure is a boundary condition. Another thing that is important to model is how the different leaflets can interact. So when they're closed, they contact each other. So we should be able to replicate that phenomena. And then finally, the material of the valve itself could be changed. It could be made stiffer or softer, or it could be made thinner or thicker, etc. And based on that, obviously the behavior will be different. So considering all these, we essentially developed a new data representation, a machine learning model representation, and as well as modified the training algorithms to capture this phenomenon. So just to give a brief recap of the neural networks that's used, we sort of combine convolution. So convolution, as you all know, is basically you take a stencil, you move it along the input data, and then you essentially produce the output. So this is this animation shows the convolution operation with a stencil which looks like this. Obviously, combining convolution operation with neural networks, you get convolutional neural networks, where basically you can map any input X to an output Y, but then the convolution operation sort of localizes this operation and essentially allows the network to learn the local spatial information. So convolutional neural networks essentially have been used for image analysis. So they can be used for image segmentation or identifying objects in an image, etc. So what we did was we combined convolution neural networks with splines. And the reason why we can do that is that the spline function itself acts as a convolution operation, where essentially the control mesh that you see here could be considered as a convolution filter, and the final surface can be computed by a convolution of the basis functions with the control mesh. And combining this idea, essentially what we did was we take the control points of a surface and represented them using a texture where you have the x, y, z coordinates corresponds to the red, green, and blue channels of a traditional image, for example. So what this allows us to do is to represent the geometry as a single image, and then that can be given as input to a convolution neural network, and that can be used to predict the deformed geometry accurately. So that brings us to the final architecture that we developed. So this is basically a autoencoder kind of architecture where you have the reference configuration, which has the 3 valve leaflets. Like I said, each of those 3 leaflets can be represented as this set of 3 textures, RGB textures for each of these valves. We pass them to a CNN and create what you call as a fusion layer. And this is where we add in extra information like the material parameters, thickness of the valve itself, and also the pressure boundary conditions that are applied to the valve. And then we have a deep convolution layer, which can essentially deconvolve this and predict the deformed configuration of the valve itself. On the other hand, certain parameters like the coaptation area, which are important, we can also directly infer from the fusion layer using a separate fully connected layer. So like I said, we also had to modify the loss function for training to make sure that we model the interactions between the leaflets and also make sure that the valve is fixed along these edges. And we do that by modifying the loss function. And then essentially we can create the complete biomechanics model for a single valve. So obviously, this is still a data-driven process. So we need data for training this model. So the way we generate this data is we run a lot of simulations for different valve geometries. So like I said, the valve geometry itself can be parameterized. So we can essentially change the valve geometry. So you can see that there are these 3 parameters like the curvature, free edge curvature, and the free edge height, and you can essentially get different valves geometries. So we essentially vary these parameters and obtain a lot of different geometries. We also varied the pressure across the valve itself from 70 to 90 millimeters of Hg, which is common physiological range for the valves. We also took different valve thicknesses based on what you can get from porcine and bovine pericardium, and then essentially ran about 20,000 simulations of just the valve closure. So now that we have these simulations, we can use that to train our model and then see what are the statistical results on the validation data or the testing data. And we found that essentially we can predict the deformed configuration really accurately, and we can also predict the cohabitation area in this case very accurately with like an R value of almost 93%. So going further, what is the advantage of such a system? We essentially looked at how different geometries and material coefficient and the other parameters can change the valve. So what we did was we simulated using our inference, using the machine learned model as inference. We inferred the cohabitation area for different geometries. And not only that, we also actually simulated these using the simulation software, which has been separately validated. And what we found was that almost all cases, the predicted cohabitation area was within, say, 5% error with the actual simulated value. And this gives the fundamental advantage of a data-driven model is that you spend a lot of time training the model, but once the model has been trained, the inference can be done in seconds, whereas each of these stars that you see took about 5 minutes to run in terms of the simulation itself. And these are some of the results. So you can see that the middle one is the actual simulation result, and then the right one is the prediction. And you can see that the predictions are really close for some of these anecdotal results. And not only we can predict the displacements, we can also predict the strains. And again, the strains can be seen to be much closer to the actual geometry results in this case. So to sort of conclude the second part, essentially we can simulate heart valves really fast using DLFEA, which is deep learning for FEA. And essentially we learn the deformation biomechanics. And then not only we are able to match the, do the simulations very fast, the fidelity of the valve simulation is also as close as you would get from a validated simulation model. And the idea is then you can use these as fast and surrogate model for valve design for a particular patient, for example, in the future. So till now, so I've been talking about traditional analysis and then talked about a data-driven workflow. And now what we have been looking at in the future is that basically what are called as physics-informed ML, where you also remove the data requirements. So you can essentially embed the physics into the neural network model that can essentially reduce the amount of data that you would need for training a particular model. And this has been popular very recently, like the last 3 years, mainly from the first paper called as physics-informed neural networks from Cardiovascular group in Brown University. And essentially what they were looking at was to solve fluid flow problem for, in this case, a biological application like a tumor, where they essentially use the neural network to solve for the flow velocity at certain locations based on data, training data, and also the physics of the fluid flow itself. We have been successful in using the same idea for our application. So we have been using it for generating microstructures and also for topology optimization, where we can essentially build in the physics of the topology optimization problem or the structure analysis, and essentially use that to simulate reduce the data requirements much lower. So just a very, very broad overview of what are physics-aware neural networks. Essentially, in traditional finite element analysis, what you do is you have a partial differential equation. You construct the weak form of the partial differential equation. Then you mesh the finite element mesh itself, and then you solve these solution to these equations at the nodes, which essentially form a matrix, which you then solve for the displacement or any other quantity of interest at the nodes. On the other hand, what happens in neural PDE solver is you map the input parameters to an output, but then what you do is you create the loss function as the residual of this weak form, along with some boundary condition information, and then you solve this, or you minimize this using stochastic gradient descent or any other training approaches, and essentially you train this for different sets of inputs and outputs. And once you perform this training, you essentially get a trained neural PDE solver, which you can essentially, during inference, you can bring in any set of input and predict the output much faster than you would need to solve this PDE. So that's the overall idea. And then we have essentially coupled that with some multi-grid approaches where you can essentially solve this at different scales, going back to my original idea of multi-scale modeling. And essentially, that way you can solve it at a core scale, use that solution to solve it at a finer scale and keep doing that. And essentially, by doing that, we can essentially perform these on a much larger mesh sizes. And also we can scale it to a lot of GPUs and do it much faster. So again, I'm not going into details of these, but just giving you a flavor of how going forward, the future of solving PDEs is going to be by using these neural PDE solvers. So like I said, we can solve the Poisson equation in up to like 512 cube resolution. And essentially, we show almost 100x speed up over traditional standalone training approaches. So hopefully that should have given you a good overview of how you can take a traditional simulation process, bring in some data analysis into it, and also moving further towards physics-aware neural networks. So I want to sort of conclude by thanking my students at the Idea Lab and also my funding sources and my collaborators. And I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Adarsh. Very exciting. We have really great that we have almost like 10 minutes for